So my presentation is entitled A Performative Lens on the Mathematics-Related Teacher Identities of Out-of-Field Mathematics Teacher Learners. Now, to break that down, the reason they're called teacher learners, as Raphael alluded to, they are on a professional development program to upskill in the area. And so the presentation mainly has 6 parts. One where I want to just briefly mention the context and post-primary mathematics education. Now, when I say post-primary, I mean secondary education. So secondary mathematics education reform in Ireland. Incidence of out-of-field teachers of maths, the government response to it, the role that mathematics teacher certification plays, and then some analysis on some participants on the program who are teaching maths out of field. So in terms of secondary mathematics education reform in Ireland, it was particularly a seminal paper or discussion paper was produced or published in 2005, and that kind of set in store what was to come in the next 10 to 15 years about issues with secondary mathematics education in Ireland in terms of teaching practices, which led to a newly developed syllabus in 2010. And along with the syllabus, there was the development of resources to help with the implementation of the new curriculum. And from this, we can I suppose, taken from what they've talked about in these papers, alludes to the idea of moving from a traditional style of mathematics teaching, which is, I suppose, recognized across the world, procedurally led, and pushing it towards a reform-oriented model of teaching, which is more, I suppose, social in nature in the classroom, building with real-life contexts and connections and so on. So that was kind of the context of moving away from a traditional style towards what could be termed reform-oriented mathematics teaching. Along this journey in 2009, it became apparent that there were a number of teachers in Irish secondary schools teaching mathematics without the requisite teacher certification, 48% to be precise. So a lot of these were at the lower secondary phase of schooling, what we call here in Ireland junior cycle. To address this, Ingersoll would talk about 2 potential reasons for why we have out-of-field teaching: the organizational occupational perspective, or rather the teacher deficit perspective, where we either have an inadequate teacher supply or inadequate teacher training. And the reason that Ireland wanted to address was inadequate teacher supply. And so they set about implementing a program to address this inadequate teacher supply. And in 2011, they had a request for tenders for the provision of a postgraduate mathematics, a course in mathematics. The document on the leftmost document here. And what's important here was it was about providing the course. And by 2012, we have the first installment of the participant handbook, and in 2021 we have the updated version. So over 300 teachers have now gone through the program, with over 7 million euros worth of funding gone into the program. But what's important to, I suppose, recognize is that it was about providing the program so that the out-of-field teachers now had the same qualifications as in-field teachers. And in Ireland, there are standards for what initial teacher education has to adhere to. And particularly at secondary level, there are curricular subject requirements. So a teacher must have accumulated a certain amount of credits in certain modules in mathematics and in mathematics pedagogy, so that they can apply to the teaching council, the governing body, so that they are now certified. The idea was that with this program, there would become a third pathway to mathematics teacher certification. So initially, there was the concurrent route, where you do an undergraduate teacher education course where you opt that you want to be a mathematics teacher at the beginning. And it's broken into 2 parts. You have your teacher education studies and your mathematics content modules. Typical, I suppose, of what's replicated across the world. You have the mathematics content modules, which are delivered by the Faculty of Mathematics, and then you have the education faculty. Within the professional studies element, then, you have your mathematics pedagogy. Now, the Bologna process was, I suppose, developed so that there could be a comparison of workload. And these concurrent programs need to have 240 credits. They're called ECTS. of which the teacher education is 120 credits and the mathematics content module is 60. So there's some discrepancy then for additional credits amongst that. But by and large, there must be a need for 5 credits of maths pedagogy. So 60 credits goes into the maths content, 5 credits goes into the maths pedagogy. If you want to opt for the consecutive route, so you must have done an undergraduate degree with mathematics content at this point, where the content modules are included in this 180 credit course. So you have your 60 credits of mathematics before you go on to qualify as a teacher by doing what's called professional masters in education. Again, you follow the same route here now with professional studies, teach and practice, foundation studies, discretionary time, which is typically some maybe research projects. And again, it's at this point you get, this accumulates to 120 credits is this course, 2 years, and the maths pedagogy again is 5. So developed in line with Schulman's work, I suppose, on teacher knowledge, a lot of this goes into subject matter knowledge, and you know it's less weighted towards, I suppose, subject pedagogical content knowledge. And this is because that's what the Teaching Council, the governing body, mandates that a qualified teacher requires. The third route was this Pdmt program. And what's different in this regard, I suppose, is that the teachers already had accumulated their professional studies, their foundation studies, their teaching practice, their discretionary time in their in-field subject area. And so what was necessary for them to have was mathematics teaching experience, that they were actually teaching maths in school. They may have attended some professional development, which was ongoing with the new curriculum, which was called Project Maths, or which is called Project Maths. They have their experience learning maths that they're bringing with them. They may be collaborating with their mathematics teacher colleagues, and then they may or may not have had in-field subject teaching experience, depending on how the position that they have at school. So from this, you can see the Pdmt program then was an avenue for them to get these mathematics content credits of 60, and the pedagogy, which mandated is 5, but the program provided 15, so it surpassed it in some regard. So the research aim here was to look at who are these teachers on the program, how have they come to teach maths, how do they see themselves as maths teachers, what has impacted on the development of their teaching practices, how do they see their participation in the program, how is the program influencing them as teachers, and then what are they doing whilst teaching maths in their classrooms. And so this talk of who they are and what they're doing leads us towards a performative perspective on identity, and enables identity, I suppose, to be the construct that can give us these insights. As has already been alluded to, identity in terms of learning, knowing, and being, as learning is a matter of identity in the sense that learning transforms who one is. It involves a change in who one is. And it is said to be the missing link between the socio-cultural context and learning. And then it's the pivot between the individual and the social context. And so it's more, it can encapsulate, I suppose, more factors that influence who these people are and what they do on a day-to-day basis. So from the interpretive paradigm case study, longitudinal case studies, 5 participants, which involve both observational research in terms of their teaching and then narrative research in terms of some interviews. So there were 5 participants in total. And the person I've decided to talk about today is John, because John was deemed an outlier in the sense that he had a significant number of years teaching. So he was teaching 18 years, and for 17 of them, he was teaching mathematics. His in-field subject was history. And so this was quite different than the typical, for instance, you might say the typical participant who enrolled on the program, who by and large was either from a business studies or science background. So we have Catherine, Mary, David, and Jane. For the most part, these were teaching mathematics for 1 or 2 years, so quite new to the subject, whereas John had been teaching for significantly longer. Data collection, given the multiplicity of identity, it meant that data must be collected across a broad range of contexts. That involved both within the program itself, on a one-to-one basis, and then the classroom, some of which was self-recorded in terms of their audio recorded lessons, and then researcher was there to record some video recorded lessons. So block 1 and video recorded lesson 1 took part at the beginning of the program, and then block 2 and video recorded lesson 2 took part 2 years later when they were almost finished almost finished the program. The block of lessons consisted of 5 consecutive mathematics lessons with the same class group. So to analyze the data, there was some narrative and thematic analysis for the interview, and then discourse analysis using some sociolinguistic tools and systemic functional linguistics for the classroom recordings. And we'll see how that plays out in John's case. To take a look at what the construct of mathematics related teacher identity, it involves some enactment, being a particular way. It involves some recognition, being recognized as a particular type of teacher. And this is where I allude back to the context, this notion, I suppose, that circulated in discourse in Ireland about being a traditional mathematics teacher or being a reform-oriented mathematics teacher. It is participatory in nature, following the work of Wenger, both in the mathematics community, within the mathematics department and the school, and within the classroom. It's relational to the environment. It involves and is typically constructed and maintained through discourse, which can involve the telling of narratives. And so there's a multiple dimensions to mathematics related teacher identity. If we were to focus on the multiple element for a moment, we would see that there could be termed first person mathematics related teacher identity and third person mathematics related teacher identity. So this was developed to capture the sense of there is who the person themselves say they are as a teacher of maths, and then there may be how they're recognized by others. So first person being their own self-understandings, third person being how are they recognized, particularly in their classroom, what kind of practices are they carrying out. And so that brings us to some of the data on first person mathematics related teacher identities, the self-understandings they have about themselves in relation to mathematics teaching. And again, to I suppose, delve a little bit deeper into the construct of mathematics related teacher identity, there is both current, which is what they say they are at the moment, and then there is designated, what they intend for the future. And as learning transforms who one is, as I mentioned earlier, as a matter of identity reconstruction, when the current moves towards the designated in some regard, we can suggest that some identity reconstruction has taken place. There has been some learning involved. So John then, when John started teaching mathematics back in 2001, he actually asked, could he teach a mathematics class in his school? And he said he positioned himself using Hobbes's adaptability scale. He was saying he was making the most of it at this point. A year later, he was still at the same point. But fast forward to 2016, and he's now very much pursuing an interest in this subject. He sees himself as a mathematics teacher, and he hasn't changed upon completion of the program. So if someone already sees himself as quite the in-field mathematics teacher, why did he engage in the program? And this is why we need to think about his designated. What story did he want to tell for the future? And he says, I know my own limits at the moment. That's why, again, I'm doing the course. I've been offered a Leaving Certificate higher level class. So Leaving Certificate higher level is the most advanced mathematics course you can take at secondary level. And for him, whether he was able to teach it at the moment or not, he said the answer is no. He wants to teach this most advanced level of mathematics, but he feels he doesn't have the capacity to do it. He adds that by interview 2, so this was at the start, halfway through the program, he says, I would love to see myself teach this. It's a 2-year course, termed 5th and 6th year in Ireland. I don't know whether that will happen because part of the course that we're doing in the PDMT, I don't see the benefit with regard to the Leaving Certificate content. And this was echoed across all the participants, this feeling that, well, the content, the mandated mathematics content modules, of which there were 60 credits, didn't really align with the curriculum he was being asked to teach. Now, how John also differed from the other participants was he did change his viewpoint on the program at his last interview. He said, I remember this time last year saying this course, this, that, and the other, you don't know. What is surprisingly done, it has made me more competent to go on and teach it. And again, it comes down to my own belief in the whole thing. And so it was just from doing the mathematics more, he just felt he was more confident and that he could take it on. Not so much any impact on his teaching practices. So if we go to this John's professional growth, he's completed the program His belief in his mathematical ability has increased, and a salient outcome for him is, yes, I could take on teaching this program. In terms of his practice then, well, his first person mathematics teacher identity, he said the story he was telling at the moment, and this was at interview 2, so halfway through the program, the theory is always pushed to the back because you try to teach the kids how to do it. You know, it's like, for example, taking a driving lesson. Do they actually know how to build an engine, or do they need to know how to drive the car? And this reflected his procedural stance on mathematics teaching at the point. It was just about how do you do the maths. Fast forward to the end of the program, and we have a new perspective. They need the theory. They need to understand where things are going and where they're coming from. Absolutely, they do. So you need to be able to strip the engine and put it back together. So there was a change in perspective, quite a different story he was now telling at the end of the program. But what did it actually look like in practice? And this leads us to G's work and socially situated identities. For the initial video recorded lesson, we see quite a traditional, what would be termed or recognized as a traditional mathematics class. They are sitting in pairs, but they're working individually. John's working on the board looked something was like this during the lesson. Again, there was no context, there was no connections. It was about how do you represent A less B in terms of set notation. What was important for John in this class was his use of cultural artifacts that Cole would talk about in shaping who one is. Here he uses state examination materials. Past examination questions really were the driving force of the lesson. From a systematic functional linguistics perspective, each lesson was broken into sequences. There weren't many moves in each sequence at this point. If there was a countable talk from a student, John typically may have interrupted, and he would have had maybe some leading talk a lot of the time. So he would have tended towards being traditional. By contrast, after the PDMT program, they're still sitting in pairs, but it was at the first point that they actually came to the board. They represented some solutions. He talked about their workings. He used curriculum supported materials, which I mentioned at the start. It was the teaching and learning plans that was now supporting his teaching, not the state examinations material. And the sequences, for which there were far less per lesson, but they were far longer, with a number of moves, with a lot more exploratory talk, generative assessment. These moves would enable him to be recognized as a reform-oriented mathematics teacher. However, 3 lessons later, he says, this is where it gets a little bit hazy, lads, if I'm being honest about it with you. And this is in reference to, he was teaching linear relations using the curriculum materials. And without going into it in too much detail, he was a little bit uncertain about the connection between 2 approaches to forming an arithmetic sequence. And so when he ends up with 2 different answers from these approaches, he says, let's just ignore that. Let's just go on gut. Your probably best bet is to use the formula that's in your logbook, right? Is that okay? If it doesn't work one way, do it the other way. And so this presentation is not to be critical of John's teaching in any way. In actual fact, John should be championed, in my opinion, for his designated mathematics-related teacher identity. He has fully, absorbed himself in the mathematics teacher community, and he's driven by the professional development to teach at the highest level he can. And he adhered to curriculum reform. He changed his practice for him because of new student assessment procedures. He adopted cultural artifacts associated with the new curriculum. And he thought this Pdmt program was the last stop, I suppose, on his journey towards that destination of telling the story of being a reform-oriented mathematics teacher, which he wanted to be, and also a higher level secondary school mathematics teacher. But there was some sort of a U-turn in the process. And I suppose this leads me to why a teacher that wants to teach in a certain way is trying to upskill as best he can, but yet he is, I suppose, encountering some difficulties, particularly in the classroom. So I suppose I said I'd finish very briefly with some questions more so than conclusions. And they're about upskilling programs for out-of-field teachers of mathematics. Who is it for? And this might seem like a straightforward question, or it might be the same for everyone, but that may not be the case. Is it for teachers? A lot of these teachers responded saying that it wasn't really helping them in their classroom. Is it for students? Well, the limited amount of credits given to pedagogy might indicate that the teaching practices, which a lot of the participants echoed, were not being changed or altered. Is it for school management to make it easier in terms of staffing shortages, for parents and guardians, or for government? The next question is, why is it being implemented? Is it to assist the teachers? Is it to enhance student learning? Is that the same thing, or is it not? Is it to alleviate staffing difficulties for school management? Are these all echoing the same agenda, or is there something different between them? Is it to alleviate worries from parents regarding the quality of their child's teacher in the sense of teacher certification? Is it to address national concerns or issues? How is it governed? Is the content predetermined, which was the case here? Often as a case of, does it offer certification, which was the case here? What autonomy has the institutional provider? In which case there was limited autonomy in the Irish context. And then how is the program regulated? Finally, how is it implemented? Who delivers the program? By and large, this was by mathematics lecturers, given that it was mandated to have the majority of credits were towards mathematics content. How is the program delivered? This was online so that it could be nationally delivered. How is participation monitored? There was no, I suppose, school placement aspect or interaction within the classroom in this regard. And then how is feedback used to inform future iterations of the program? And I guess that is where we're at now. Finally, it brings me back to, I suppose, Kenny and Hobbes's framework for effective professional development and factors influencing mathematics-related teacher identity reconstruction, both first person and third person. And what I suppose reflected on, that the structural features and the core features, the form, the duration, the participation, the content, the active learning and coherence, all of these elements, the decisions that were made with regard to those in terms of program design impacted the capacity of the program to influence mathematics-related teacher identity.